Hey everyone, welcome to another advanced sports analytics application tutorial. In this video, we're going to be covering how to use our NFL ownership tracker application. The general purpose of this application is to give you access to historic ownership levels for players across different main slate contests. So we only have ownership levels for classic main slate contests. We don't have information on showdown contests yet. That is a contest type we'd like to gain more ownership data and flexibility with. We're still working on developing that. Um, you can view ownership in one of two ways in this application, either as an aggregate table or as a plot, where you're plotting ownership as a y variable against a set of x variables, time, player salary, fantasy actuals, stuff like that. Um, in the aggregate table tab, there's a number of different ways you can specify players that you would like to view ownership for. Most simplistically, you can just type in player names and view their ownership levels, average ownership, minimum ownership, and maximum ownership level uh, by different contest types. So looking at large field tournaments like Millionaire Maker or Play Action, or more medium-sized tournaments like the Wildcat, or for cash games like the $25 single entry massive double up on DraftKings. And you can also filter by date range. So we're looking at Lockett and Metcalf ownerships for the 2020 season. If you wanted to go back to the 2019 season, you could type that in and you would see ownership levels aggregated across the state range. You could also narrow it smaller to like ownership levels over the last few weeks. The default is going to be to show ownership for the 2020 season. Aside from typing in player names, you could look at table of all players by a specific position. So if we want to look at ownership levels of all wide receivers, we just type in wide receiver, and the table would populate and sort by average ownership for all wide receivers. And see that for the play action tournament, we can go back to Millionaire Maker. For the Millionaire Maker tournament in 2020, Devontae Adams has averaged the highest ownership. These are in games that the player is active. So I know there was a game or two where Adams was out. Uh, Probably still garnered some ownership for people selecting inactive Adams, but we're only looking at average ownership in games where a player was active. So you can see Adams for Millionaire Maker tournaments this year has averaged 21.5% ownership and never had ownership below about 17%, never had ownership in excess of 26%. Looks like the guy who has had the highest ownership level in a single week in Millionaire Maker uh, Sunday main slate tournaments, Robbie Anderson. Not sure what week exactly that was. You can also search by position and also filter by team. So going back to that Seattle, Lockett, and Metcalf scenario, you type in wide receivers on Seattle, and we see the table populate with Metcalf, Lockett, David Moore, Freddie Swain. We can see different ownership levels for these different players in the Seattle wide receiver core. Or we could delete out position and just look at average or aggregate ownership for all Seattle players, independent of position. And we can sort on these different columns by clicking the column that we want to sort on. And yeah, it's a useful way for identifying players if we are trying to do some manual projection for ownership and want to look back at historic averages of players. As a useful way to do it in the tabular view. Plot view is another good way to look at ownership levels. Not so much aggregate, but against some X variable. Again, we can filter on certain dates. So I'm going to look at only 2020. And let's go back to our Metcalf Lockett. And And we can select, our contest, Millionaire Maker, and select what X variable we want to track ownership against. So the default is just to look at it as a time series, ownership over time, and see how ownership levels kind of rise and fall over the course of the season. And you can hover over any data point and get more information about that data point. So the opponent of the player on a given week, their salary, and their actual DKP, DraftKings point performance. I think it's interesting to see how players' ownership uh, compares to their actual performance. You can do that with the hovering over the data points. You can also select this little icon and it'll give you multiple hovers so you can look at the data points of all players. Going to add like a guy like Devontae Adams, you can see that pretty much week over week, Adams is always garnering higher ownership than either of these Seattle receivers when they're both featured on the main slate, which I guess has only been twice this year. But an interesting, comparison options here. You can also plot versus salary, so I think it's interesting to see how players, ownership trends relate relative to their salary. Seems like ownership on Devontae Adams hasn't really shied. The field hasn't shied away from Adams in a big way as his salary has trended up. Metcalf, on the other hand, there has been suppressed ownership at increased salary levels for him. It's not necessarily that we can look at these trends in a vacuum, as sometimes lower and higher ownership can be informed not only by salary but by matchup, by performance the week prior, stuff like that. But I still think it's just a useful way to take a look at ownership trends around players. And then we can also look at ownership levels relative to actual performance. I think it's interesting to see which players the field is correctly identifying as premier targets by nailing, high ownership levels at high production instances. So like we look at Adams' two highest performing weeks, and I don't know, it seems like in general Adams is always garnering pretty high ownership. So maybe we can just delete him out for comparative purposes. But it's interesting, like we see Metcalf so far is, the field is kind of accurately getting correct. Like his ownership levels are highest, or have been this year highest, at his higher scoring weeks. They haven't been truly explosive weeks like he experienced in 2019, but in general, the field is owning Metcalf at a higher rate in games where he has scored well. And Lockett is kind of up and down. Like there have been weeks where the field has been high on Lockett, and he performed accordingly. Like week 3 against Dallas, about 18% ownership in the Millie Maker, 40 points. Field got it right there. Other weeks where the week after, I guess week 3 and week 4, where Lockett was 22.5% owned in the Millionaire Maker at 7,000, and only hit 6 DraftKings points. And then his best week, week 7 against Arizona, ownership only down at 10%. So something to consider, players and how frequently kind of the field is owning them at levels that are in line with their performance. Maybe in future contests, we might be more inclined to roster players who the field regularly misses on, in terms of ownership, players who are able to achieve their ceiling performances when the field historically has not shown a super, I guess, where the field has not, been able in the past to identify that player in, an exceptional ceiling spot. So I think looking at ownership versus actuals is, a potentially useful tool for viewing ownership and trying to target players that we want to roster for desirable ownership properties historically. So I hope that helps, and you guys will find your own use cases for our ownership tracker. If you have any questions about the tool, you can reach out to us and we'd be happy to try to help you guys out.